afternoon and welcome to the Archaeology of Connecticut. I'm Glenda Rose, President of Friends of the Office of State Archaeology, here with State Archaeologist Dr. Sarah Sportman, co-host Scott Brady, and our wonderful guests. Today's topic is King Philip's War, of which I am embarrassed to say I know very little. War is always a painful, uncomfortable subject, but it's a part of our history and as such deserves to be discussed. We should try to understand it and learn from it. Whether we like it or not, this war changed the cultural landscape of New England and played a major role in the development of Connecticut. And since this show is called The Archaeology of Connecticut, our two guests will also talk about battlefield archaeology, which is another tool used to understand the war and its impact. So please join us for the next hour and enjoy the show. If you have a question, please send a quick email to info@icrvradio.com. Now here's Sarah to introduce our guests and begin the discussion.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our May episode of the Archaeology of Connecticut. Tonight we're going to be joined by Drs. Ashley Bissonnette and Kevin McBride for a discussion of King Philip's War. King Philip's War was a devastating regional conflict that profoundly impacted both indigenous and colonial European populations across New England in 1675 and 76, and also had catastrophic long-term consequences for Native people. So we'll discuss the history of the war, the role of European and Indigenous troops from Connecticut, and the broader impacts of the conflict, as well as recent battlefield archaeology related to the war. So to get started, I'd like to welcome our guests, Dr. Kevin McBride and Dr. Ashley Bissonnette. Kevin McBride is a professor in anthropology at UConn and is the region's preeminent battlefield archaeologist. Ashley is an historian, herbalist, teacher, and scholar. They've worked together on battlefield projects related to King Philip's War and recently co-authored a book chapter entitled The Battle of Great Falls, Wissanatawag, is that right? Pascumskit, Historical Trauma and the Legacy of King Philip's War. So to get started, let's talk a little bit about the history of the conflict, because although it was a major event in the 17th century, most people today probably don't know too much about it. So to get started, can we just talk a little bit about what King Philip's War was, what were the causes, and you just kind of set the stage for the rest of the conversation?
Sure. Excuse me. It is a fact that, the conflict is largely unknown, certainly outside of New England, but in fact, it was one of the most devastating conflicts in American history, proportional to population, in terms of the number of deaths, the amount of English and native infrastructure, communities that were killed or died from starvation and disease. And it started as a small conflict in Plymouth Colony. King Philip was otherwise known as Metacomet, was Massasoit's son, who is well known to most of us as the Wampanoag sachem who greeted the Pilgrims in Plymouth. And they enjoyed a very close and an allied relationship for about 40 years. But as inevitably, English encroachments on native lands, imposition of English law, native people began to erode that relationship. And there were a few events leading up to the war that precipitated, some shots being exchanged between settlers in Swansea and some of Metacomet's men. And what started out as a small conflict quickly grew to engulf all of New England within just a few months. And I think that how quickly it spread is a testament to the dissatisfaction of Native people throughout the region, and realizing that they had very little chance to maintain their livelihood and their lifeways in the near future because of English presence and encroachments. And I think also one thing we don't understand, we haven't really understood, is the importance of kinship ties with Native people, particularly with Philip and other Native groups such as the Nipmuc and Quabog and others that really helped to bring this conflict into a large-scale war for the next 2 years.
So let's delve a little bit more just into the impacts of colonial English expansion on Native people and why it basically put them in such a desperate position by the 1670s in terms of maintaining their way of life.
Sure. So with the English coming in through the region so fast, the way they plant, the way they gather, the way they move across the landscape is all going to be hindered. So by the time the English come, they have cows, they have pigs that are on the landscape. They're just, like Kevin said, they were encroaching on their overall way of life. So it was a boiling point that by the time of the King Philip's War, they said, we've had enough. And they were really trying to hold on to their traditional ways of living and life throughout the duration of the war and even after the war. But as the war progresses, it becomes harder and harder.
Is there a sense, I know when colonial settlers first start to arrive here in New England, the native population has been decimated before they get here. Has it rebounded at this point? Is it growing, or is it still declining, or are we kind of holding water from what the first English people found when they arrived?
For some communities, they're still pretty decimated. Some communities were more hard hit than others. I think what we forget as well, when disease comes through, that the English are not immune. So even communities, English or Native, they're being hurt. And there are waves of smallpox epidemics coming through the region. We think about the 1617, the 1619, there's the 1633, the 34. And then by the time King Philip's War, it's really what we do see on the map is just these epizones, just these epidemics grow and grow and grow. So nobody's immune to this.
So I think another important point, maybe before we get really into what we're going to talk about today, is to talk about how this really didn't come out of nowhere, right? Tensions had been rising and boiling for several decades in the lead up to this conflict. Can you speak a little bit to kind of the tensions in the 1640s and 50s and 60s after the Pequot War, kind of leading up to this? I mean, there was a lot of fear and apprehension that something like this could happen, right, all throughout those decades.
That was very much on all of the English minds. The big English fear was that there would be another uprising, as happened in Virginia in 1622. And it almost happened with the Pequot War in 1636 to 38. And that was their fear. And the 40 years between end of the Pequot War and King Philip's War was really a time of a lot of volatility. The power vacuum left by the Pequots led to just constant warfare between Native groups as they sought to fill that power vacuum, and that's just glossing over the complexity of these conflicts. But the English were always very concerned, and in fact, in the 1640s and the 1660s, there were a couple of incidences that took place that there's very good evidence that Native groups were attempting to form a coalition to rise up against the English and, essentially drive them back into the sea. And King Philip's War, it seems to have been planned for quite a long time. And Native people were amassing firearms, ammunition, other weapons, and there's a lot of planning going on. And the sense one gets from the sources is that they may have been ready to begin that war, but the next year or two. But events preceded their planning, and the war started before they were prepared for.
I guess maybe another thing that we probably, to kind of set the stage, is to talk about, who was on basically the two sides of this war, because it wasn't purely colonists versus the Native coalition, right? There are Native allies to the English as well. But maybe we can, if you just give us a rundown of the groups, and we'll refer to, I guess, the Native coalition as the groups that were allied with Philip and attacking English settlements. And but there's also the English and their Native allies on the other side. So if you could give us a rundown of those groups, that would be really helpful, I think.
There was, in fact, a very Native groups in Connecticut pretty much either allied themselves with the English or stayed neutral. And Connecticut had a very different policy toward their native inhabitants than Plymouth Colony or Massachusetts Bay. And I think part of that stems from their experiences in the Pequot War, where they enlisted allies as the Mohegan, the Wangunk, and for a period of time the Narragansett against the Pequot. And they understood the importance of those relationships. So for 40 years, they tried to maintain good relationships with the Native communities in Connecticut. And as soon as the war broke out, they reached out to them and were very concerned that if their prospective Native allies weren't given fair treatment, they might go over to support King Philip. And Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay had completely the opposite policy. They did not embrace their Native communities. They considered them enemies. Even the potential allies and the praying Indians, they put them on concentration camps, literally, in Massachusetts Bay. And the reason that was important, from Connecticut's perspective, the war really didn't come to or affect Connecticut. They kept the war outside of their boundaries. And their close relationship with Mohegan, Pequot, Western Niantic, Tungus, and other Native allies were instrumental in their success on the battlefield. Probably without their Native allies, the war may well have gone very different.
So on the one side, you have the English, and at this point, you have the Organization of the United Colonies, right, in southern New England, where they've gotten together and formed a coalition, Connecticut, Massachusetts Bay, and Plymouth, and Mohegan, Pequot, Western Niantic, and some other smaller allied groups right on one side. And the other side is Wampanoag, Narragansett, and many of the tribes in Massachusetts along the Connecticut River, including Pecumtuck, Agawam, Nortuck, and then also many of the Nipmuc groups from central Massachusetts as well. So it really is a region-wide conflict, and it spreads into northern New England as well. So what were the strategies? I mean, apart from, you just talked about Connecticut and Massachusetts having very different approaches to their relationships with their Native populations, but what were the strategies that were applied by the two sides during the conflict?
That's a good question, and we're still trying to figure all that out. But Connecticut, their military units were comprised of not just Native guides, but their units were Native communities. The men from Native communities were fully integrated into English units, where you would have, if an expedition of 400 men went out, you would have half of those men would be Native men. And so the English and their Native allies, Pequot, Mohegan, fought together throughout the war and were considered to be the most effective field army. And Connecticut strategy 2 is based upon speed. It was based upon mobility. Most of Connecticut's soldiers were dragoons, basically soldiers mounted on horseback to get to the battlefield quickly. And while native people, native allies didn't use horses, they could easily keep up and, act as flankers and guides and protect the the English troops to get them to the battlefield safely. Plymouth and Mass Bay they were very cumbersome. Their units were made of both horse and foot, soldiers on foot. Their supplies were carried on with ox carts compared to Connecticut, who carried a lot of their supplies on horseback. So they were very quick. Connecticut was very quick, very mobile, and they're referred to as flying armies. They could quickly get to where they needed to go to engage the enemy based upon intelligence that they were receiving from their native allies.
Hey, Kevin, when the actual fighting starts, this is not Civil War like marching Napoleonic, right? This is more of a guerrilla style fighting, or do we know?
That's a good question, and we're still trying to figure that all out. Part of the problem is the sources. I mean, they're all English sources, so sometimes you're not as detailed about both enemy native coalition forces and their tactics and strategies and how the allies were used. But we see evidence for a lot of different kinds of fighting. There are occasions when there were actually pitched battles in open field. For the most part, the native coalition forces used surprise, ambush, usually from ambushing from swamps where the English were loath to go into. They greatly feared swamps. They wouldn't go in there. They wouldn't pursue their native enemy in there because they knew that they would just get, literally wiped out, which happened pretty early in the war a number of times. So native people are very effective in employing their strategies in the field. But, mostly against Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay. Connecticut was never ambushed. The most significant casualties Connecticut suffered was in the Great Swamp Fight when they attacked the Narragansett Village on December 19th. They lost more men in that battle than they did the entire war, whereas Mass Bay and Plymouth were suffering, countless casualties, and they didn't really understand how important it was to use native allies until almost the end of the war.
And then just to kind of, again, set my head right, at this point, are we talking, these are guns, or are we still using bow and arrow to any significant extent?
The native coalition forces had significant number of firearms. We always wonder just what the ratio was, but from what we can discern, about at least half of native coalition forces were armed with flintlocks. We rarely see a mention of arrows being used, except as fire arrows, but we do know that they were armed with them. And most of the firearms the native were using, at least early in the war, they had spent years acquiring from the Dutch or the French, and they were Dutch and French firearms, which sometimes help us to identify their presence on the battlefield because they tend to be smaller caliber. But they also, one of the tactics that the coalition forces often tried to employ was to get close enough to the English forces to engage them hand to hand.
That's a bad day.
Very bad day.
So you mentioned the Great Swamp Fight, right, which is an attack on a Narragansett village, on a settlement. And I think one thing that's important to know about this conflict is that a good portion of it actually took place within settlements, right, and very direct attacks on English settlements, on native settlements. I mean, this was a conflict that involved a lot of civilian casualties, a lot of civilian destruction of homes, of livestock, of crops, of food supplies on both sides. Can you talk a little bit about that aspect of the conflict?
Sure. So we do see a lot of the scorched earth policy. Whatever supplies that the English had, the natives are trying to intercept and take those supplies. To what degree they're actually using them as far as cattle and of that sort is a little bit unknown toward the beginning of the war, but toward the end of the war, we're seeing starvation really take hold. So the way they're just destroying supplies is changing a little bit. I think overall, also what we're seeing too, as far as change in the landscape, houses completely destroyed. We see people consolidating toward one another, living with one another. So disease is also taking hold in that regard as well. But yeah, homes, cattle, supplies, but also back to the way that certain peoples were equipped for the war. Connecticut colony actually had a traveling doctor with them, Gershom Buckley. Massachusetts was not really well prepared as far as medically. So the way they are actually moving on the landscape is changing in order to get hold of doctors or supplies or whatever it may be. But yeah, there's a lot going on there.
Yeah. So I guess maybe we should talk about some of the major battles that affected the outcome of the war and some of the battlefield archaeology that you've done and how that's kind of maybe changed or added to information that we previously had about these conflicts or the information that's available in the documentary record.
We've done, and we're in the process of still doing battlefield archaeology surveys on one of the battlefields, but we've done a number of Pequot War battlefields, but we're doing 2 King Philip's War battlefields. One we've previously done is the Second Battle of Nipsachuk, which occurred on July 3rd and 4th, 1676, which actually was one of the last major battles of the war. But there is an interesting connection to the battlefield that we are currently surveying, which is the Battle of the Great Falls, which took place May 19th, 1676, in what is now Deerfield and Montague and Gill, Massachusetts. And it turns out it was surprisingly one of the, if not one of the most significant battles of the war. And at that time, the broader story is coalition forces and the remaining English in the settlements in the upper part of the Connecticut Valley are vying to control the upper part of the valley because of the cornfields and the soils. It was that part of the valley from Springfield to Deerfield was referred to as the breadbasket of New England. And coalition strategies were to constantly attack the settlements in an attempt to force them to abandon their settlements. And they did abandon 2 of them. Northfield, Squaqueag, and Deerfield, Pecumtuck, were abandoned. And they almost abandoned Hatfield and Hadley. And, that part of in the final months of the war, all of the action focused on the Connecticut Valley, coalition attempts to drive the English out and English attempts to maintain their hold on it. And this particular battle that took place on May 19th was precipitated by a coalition raid on some English cattle and sheep and horses in fields in Deerfield. And I should also point out that at this point of the war, because of the English strategy to basically starve native people, keep them moving so they couldn't hunt, fish, plant, and Ashley can speak to the impact of that strategy on native people. They had all gathered, all the tribes, Pecumtuck, Nunatak, Nipmuc, Quabog, Narragansett, and many others had all gathered at Great Falls, one of the largest fishing places on the Connecticut River. And there they hoped to resupply so they could continue the war in the spring. And as part of that effort was constantly attacking English settlements. And one of the results of that raid on English livestock in Deerfield was the local towns to gather some volunteers and some garrison troops. Now, these were not very experienced soldiers. These were, if you were, on garrison duty, you weren't the best. And these were not at all like the experienced Connecticut armies or some of the Mass Bay forces. Plymouth never fought outside of Plymouth Colony. So under Captain Turner and Lieutenant Holyoke, they gathered about 150 men. And their intent was to, on horseback, they were mostly on horseback, move north about 15 miles and attack a native village in what is now the Riverside area of Gill, Massachusetts, on the north bank of the north or west bank of the Connecticut River, and which they did, and they achieved success. As the English usually did, it was a dawn surprise attack on a unsuspecting village, and the attack killed about 300 people. Most of them drowned or were, swept over the falls and dashed to death on the rocks below. But, because these were not experienced soldiers, they didn't really do proper reconnaissance and gather intelligence. What they didn't know was that was just one of a dozen villages in that area. And in the hour or so after the attack on the village, the native coalition forces were gathering their forces for a counterattack. And they basically attacked the retreating English, and they were panicked. This was a panicked retreat. 6.5 miles back to the Deerfield River, and by the end of the day, they killed. There was about 60% casualties, which is very, very high. But what's interesting about that battle is, technically it was a victory for the native forces, and I don't want to minimize the 300 people who were killed in the initial attack. But the second phase of the battle was a coalition victory. For reasons that I don't still understand, the native coalition basically gave up the valley, and they started to return home. This is when Philip went back to his homeland, Narragansett, Squaw-Sachem, Quiapan. She was returning home. This is where the Second Battle of Nipsachuk took place, and they were returning to their homelands knowing they faced certain death. At that point in the war, there's something about this battle and the aftermath that the coalition forces had just basically had enough, and they began to sue for peace, and they began to return home. And so that battle of Turner Falls was literally the beginning of the end of the war.
Sure. Cycling around back to starvation and some of those trends, right before Turner's Fall in April of 1676, Philip had with him some 300 men, women, and children. He recently lost around 40 of his best warriors, and with them, most of them are sick. So I always question, too, how fast is he moving across the landscape? How much is really hindered? We know a lot. And the English as well. I think I got really excited for this part of the project, or with Turner's Falls, because with the records, I'm beginning to see the way that disease plays out, and soldiers saying, we're sick, we're not moving. Even Captain Turner said, I really don't want to do this battle. I'm sick. He petitions to Massachusetts. He just doesn't want to carry on. So, and we see that play out on the battlefield, which is pretty exciting for us when we were doing more of the record research, and just seeing how really kind of scrambled they were during the retreat and stuff like that, and men falling off their horses because they're sick and so on. But
And it seems like it's not just, so you have the conflict, right? And you have people dying as a result of the conflict directly, but you have disease. But there's also, over those 2 years, a number of environmental things that kind of make it more challenging for people to have food supplies and to, be provisioned well enough to be healthy, and especially during this time of extra stress and conflict. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So there is droughts, and then there's floods, and there's kind of, when you go through the records, it's really this up and down, really severe changes in weather. So we're seeing rotted storage pits that many of the native peoples were dependent upon to get them through the winters. Even 75, we're beginning to see really an uptick in starvation. So it's not even later in the war into 76 that we're beginning to see these patterns really spike. But yes, if you're starved, the way you're going to build up immunity, it's compromised. Right. And then if you couple that with the stress, it's just, it's a lot for the populations to handle. And we do see most of them perish. If you go through the records, so there are two historians that we really credit a lot of our information to, Increase Mather and William Hubbard. And he says more people die by disease than the sword. And again, that quote's a little bit more descriptive than what I just gave you, but I think it really tells a story of really the toll of starvation, really the toll of disease.
Kevin, I know the battlefield projects that you've done in the past. Are you seeing an archaeological signature that you can follow on this King Philip's War portion yet? Or are we premature on looking for that, or where does that stand?
We do. We actually do see the battle unfold. One thing that's interesting about the Battle of Turner's Falls is the linear battle. So it takes place over 6.5 miles, and we're basically chasing the musket balls. We're following the musket balls, and it's amazing what one can tell from an assemblage of musket balls in terms of tactics, potential weapons. Sometimes you can tell direction of fire if a musket ball impacts against a rock or a steep hill, things of that nature. But what's most interesting about this battle is the sophistication of the coalition tactics, leadership, communication. This is one of the best examples I've seen of the sophistication, command and control, and various tactics employed by coalition forces against an English force. Granted, the English force were pretty much just panicked and fleeing, although at some point Lieutenant Holyoke gets it under control, and they begin to successfully make some defensive tactics and movements. But we were surprised at just how well planned, and I shouldn't say planned because their actions weren't planned, but the coalition forces at this point in the war were highly experienced. There's multiple, their units are made up of members of different tribes. Their leaders come from different tribes, so a group of Narragansetts wouldn't necessarily be led by a Narragansett sachem. It seems to be situational in terms of leadership. They had some really good leaders who understood tactics, weapons, and the English tactics very, very well. So the coalition, they were a formidable fighting force. And just to underscore what Ashley has been talking about, it's I think one of the largest factors, most important factors in the eventual defeat of coalition forces was illness, sickness, and disease. I'm not sure there was a single healthy native combatant at this point in the war. Even Philip had dysentery. He's mentioned it twice. It's mentioned twice. So I think that played a role, but be that as it may, this does underscore the sophistication of an experience of the native forces. And just, early on in the war, for the first 6 months of the war, the English just defeated at every single battle, exception of Connecticut. And that's, a testament to the sophistication and leadership of these native forces. I think later in the war, as the English forces become more sophisticated and experienced, they begin to gain the upper hand, particularly with use of their native allies.
I was going to say, I want to just kind of circle back a little bit when we talk about battlefield archaeology. We actually did a show on it a couple of years ago, so if you're interested in learning more about the methods of battlefield archaeology, that would be great to check out in the archives of ICRV or FOSA. But basically, we're talking about archaeology that's done largely through metal detector surveys, right, and mapping and trying to map the routes of retreat and the actions on battlefields based on the artifacts that result from that you can find with metal detectors. I just want to take it back to Connecticut a little bit before we kind of get into the long-term aftermath of the conflict. We talked a little bit about how Connecticut really didn't suffer any major battles. Connecticut fared fairly well during the war, and Connecticut tried to maintain fairly decent relationships with Native people and Native allies, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. And I just want to bring it back a little bit and maybe kind of focus on what we've been looking at the Hollister site just for a couple of minutes. So Connecticut didn't have any major battles, but there was a lot of fear and suspicion and some small targeted attacks that kind of got everybody worked up and inspired people to, engage in really serious preparations for the possibility of conflict coming to Connecticut, including at the Hollister site, where last year we found a portion of the palisade wall that was constructed in Glastonbury on the Connecticut River in 1675. Can you just talk a little bit more in detail about the situation in Connecticut?
It's true that there were no major battles, but our colleague, Colonel Jason Warren, who wrote a book recently, Connecticut Unscathed, Connecticut and King Philip's War, has actually documented many dozens of small attacks, raids. I'm not sure they warrant the description of a full of an engagement, but that was very strategic. And I mentioned before that coalition strategy was to empty the Connecticut Valley of the English. And there were two tactics to do that. One was constantly attack the English settlements, Hatfield, Hadley, Northampton, etc. But the other thing that they did was try to mitigate Connecticut's presence. Connecticut was a very formidable force in the Connecticut Valley. They were the major presence there, protecting the Connecticut Valley settlers. And one of the tactics by coalition was to conduct small raids into Connecticut to draw the Connecticut Army south to protect Connecticut. And it worked. And this is what's going on in October of 75, and again in the spring of 76. So there were a number of small engagements. There were a number of scares on the east side of the river where the Hollister site is. And, we did find about 30 or so impacted musket balls at the Hollister site that speak to some kind of engagement that undocumented. It was maybe we just have to look a little more carefully, but my guess is it's part of that overall strategy. And these forces, they weren't Connecticut natives conducting these raids, because they captured some of them. They're Narragansett, they're Pecumtuck, they're Nipmuc. There's a number of tribes represented in these raids, and it's part of that coalition strategy. They just were never able to conduct a massive attack, and I think that's primarily because Connecticut forces were just too good, well-armed, and experienced.
Yeah, and I think, though, if you look at the documents from the time period in the colonial records, at least, the fear is definitely there, and the preparations are being made, right? They're having people come into the towns. They want them to bring food stores into the towns. They want the allied native communities to come into the towns and store their food into the towns. Hollister decides not to do that and decides to request permission to palisade his own property. And we seem to have archaeological evidence on this site of the Hollister family and the local Wonga community maybe working together, cooperating as a form of, defense and protection in this kind of uncertain landscape of not knowing if the conflict's going to come knocking at your door. And maybe it did. I mean, based on the amount of material we have at the site, just a tremendous amount of gunflints and gunflint production and reworking and musket balls and impacted musket balls. And, the possibility is that people are just training, practicing, preparing, but you kind of get the sense that something else happened. And hopefully over the next couple of years, we can get a little bit deeper into that. But
while we're talking about firearms, we've had a conversation up in the lab about cylindrical shot, and there may have been a propensity with native people to use that. Could you talk a little bit and maybe explain to people what cylindrical shot is?
So you're familiar with a round musket ball, which is cast in a bullet mold, and usually it's cast to fit the size of the firearm, your personal firearm. Those are actually not used as widely as what we refer to as small shot, which is lower diameter ball that would be loaded in a firearm for more of a buckshot effect. It looks like 70% of the musket balls we have recovered on all our battlefields are the small shot. But there's a third type, and that's cylindrical shot. So picture a barrel. It's not round. It's sort of shaped more like a barrel. And usually it can be made in two ways. One, you can cast it in a long mold that might be 2 feet long, so you'd have a cylinder, and then you would cut it into 1/4 inch or 3/4 of an inch segments, and you would load your weapon with that. That seems one reason for that is logistics. You're not able to quickly acquire musket balls to appropriate to your weapon. The other way to make cylindrical shot that would fit your weapon, let's say your weapon's a 55 caliber, that's the diameter of the gun barrel, and you've got a 60 diameter ball. It's not going to fit, but you can pound it and shape it into a cylinder that will fit that 55 caliber weapon. And it does, it's not as effective in terms of aiming. It is effective if it happens to hit you, because it's, does a lot more damage. But the chances of you hitting something any more than 10 meters away is pretty slim. But we do find a fair amount of cylindrical shot. It's a low percentage, 2% perhaps. But very often we see it in context that we think it's being fired by coalition forces, which might make sense. They may be struggling to acquire enough of ammunition, or they might be doing it just to, be a little more devastating on impact.
Now, I don't want to break all the hearts of the Oak Island crew that's listening, but they have found 3 pieces of lead that they are calling gold weights to weigh off all the gold coins that are buried there. And it's cylindrical shot, 100%.
I knew that you had an agenda with that question.
I do.
Wow, now I know. That's a good piece of information.
So I think Well, I guess I think we have about 10 or 15 minutes left, and I don't know if there's anything else we want to talk about Hollister and the work that we've been doing there that kind of feeds into this King Philip's War discussion before we get into the broader impacts. Does anybody have any?
Well, I just say, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No. I was just going to say it's, the work you guys have been doing is just exemplary. It's incredible. And the fact that you've documented an indigenous presence there that based on ceramics, we can, it might be allied native forces there, don't know, but you're right, there's definitely a King Philip's War story there. And then Lieutenant John Hollister was pretty active during the war. He knew the language. He was leading expeditions up the Connecticut Valley. But the other thing I just want to mention very quickly is coalition practice of psychological warfare, and Ashley can speak to this too. There's some, you mentioned fear before, and coalition forces definitely wanted to instill fear into the English. And one of the things that they always attempted to do was destroy what it meant to be English. And it manifests itself in some pretty interesting ways. One way is frequent use of torture. Another way is they would always strip the English dead of their clothing, and they would be naked and they'd be lying prone. There's no greater insult than to take someone's clothes if you're a native person. And the other thing they would do is wreak havoc upon English livestock. Yes, they did eat them on occasion, but there's several instances where they would cut off the leg of a cow and then send the cow back into the English settlement. And all these things speak to they're attempting to make statements and attempting to undermine English culture, livelihood, throughout the war.
Yeah, I would just say for the audience, we're going to go back to Hollister pretty soon, and we're going to chase that palisade. So stay tuned in the fall. We might have some more news on that.
Yeah. So let's spend the rest of the time that we have kind of talking about the aftermath of this conflict, which has, very long-reaching effects. And just, before we do that, I did want to kind of just backtrack into the Connecticut, because we've kind of painted a picture that might be a little bit too rosy about the relationship between Connecticut colony and its native allies. Being friends with the English was a tricky business, I think, for native people. There was, in order to ensure, there was not a lot of trust, even though they had these relationships, right? And there was always a concern that people might go, because they understood that native people had kin ties to these groups that were on the other side in this conflict. But, there was a lot of hostage taking of family members to kind of keep people in line. There were curfews put on native groups that were living outside of English communities. There were roster lists that they were keeping track of people's comings and goings, and their ability to travel freely was very much restricted during this time period. So I think being allies was kind of it was always an uneasy alliance, I think, and lots of times that had dramatic impacts on the native communities who were supplying these forces that aided Connecticut in the conflict. But Ashley, can you talk a little bit about the long-term effects of this? I mean, we've talked about sickness and disease and kind of the decimation of communities. There's also slavery and lots of other long-term impacts that come out of this.
Yeah, I was really taking a public health approach, looking at some of the more contemporary health disparities that we see today. So alcoholism, depression, suicide, and just trying to get a sense of what planted those seeds. Where did they start and begin? So when we think about health disparities, they just don't happen overnight. They're really severing, or these colonialists really severed their connection to their culture, their way of life, the way they use medicine, the way they talk, and how they view themselves. So I was really interested in that, but also with the Battle of Turner's Falls, we turned it very much into a public archaeology project. So we wanted to get the Native insight, not just of the past history, what had happened for King Philip's War, but how it really played out in their families, what they thought, how they connected to that history. And it was really interesting to see the kinds of stories that came out, and we cataloged those stories with the grant and everything, and those were really eye-opening for us. And they gave some insights into the battle itself, but it really was really great to see how they want the history to be told today. Whether that's in public signage, looking at curriculum that really honors an Indigenous way of life, and so on and so on. But there's a lot of richness when it comes to public archaeology and doing the community assessments. And I was grateful that we had time to do that.
I think, throughout the 17th century, right, Native populations are suffering many, many impacts of settler colonialism, right? And one of the things about the livestock, right, one of the reasons why they were treated so brutally by Native forces during this war is that the livestock themselves posed such a dramatic threat to Native lifeways. The land that they were acquired, the way that they ate things and trampled things and just got into everything was a dramatic impact on Native ways of life. Additionally, after the war, many captives were sold into slavery. It was a similar situation to after the Pequot War, right? That further kind of decimated and separated communities and families, and kept people away from their traditional homelands, their traditional medicines, their traditional way of life. And I think that, it was really kind of, a very dramatic, I think, turning point for what was to come later throughout the colonial period for Native people, in terms of their dispersal and dispossession across the landscape. So it's a conflict that it's really interesting that there's so little taught about it, in school, and hopefully as we get into these new guidelines for teaching about Indigenous history in the public schools and things like that, we can get into this. But there's still a lot of resistance, I think, there for talking about trauma. The idea that it's just too uncomfortable or too hard for students and things like that. So we'll see how that goes. But I don't know if...
Yeah, could you talk, or can you maybe give us an example of something that someone said about, that kind of you take back to that time period and how it's affected them today? I've listened to Japanese who were interred during World War II, and you kind of see, now we're several generations past that, but it still is something that is really strongly affects them. And do you have an example maybe that you could share?
Sure. And back to Sarah's comment as well, David Tallpine White, who had passed away a couple of years ago, was, especially when we first started the project, he had just a beautiful way of speaking. He said, we shouldn't necessarily hide the history from children because it's part of place, and history is in place, in situ, and part of that healing also happens in that space, in that community. So talking about the landscape and how they reconnect, like this happened here, but Native people can come back to the areas and do some more of their Indigenous sports or learn the Indigenous plants and so on and so on. But to get the rest of the community involved and have that discussion and to build that rapport and to build those connections moving forward. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think it's a really complicated scenario, and I think maybe they still don't even know how much it's affected their communities.
We forget that King Philip's War profoundly, fundamentally changed the cultural landscape of New England for Native people, and whether you are allied with or enemy against, you didn't fare well. And just an example, I'll just bring up the Massachusetts Pequots very, very quickly. I mean, one of the, Connecticut English policy was to always maintain good relations, keep friendly Indians nearby for, if need be, for that coming war. And the Pequots, who were a defeated people, by the eve of King Philip's War, they had a land base of 3,000 acres. within 2 decades after the war, they had a land base of 900 acres, and it continued to decline. Mohegans, staunch allies of the English, fared the same. So the communities that are in Connecticut today, Mohegan, Eastern Pequot, Mashantucket Pequot, Scotticook, Golden Hill Pegusset, and they are, they're remnants, they're survivors, but, it's very different than what that landscape looked like in 1676.
So the irony of that is they didn't even get to keep not the original land that they had, but the land they got as, this is okay for you to go here, and they didn't even keep that.
They did not need their allies anymore. The big native scare was over.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. It always goes by so quickly. But thank you so much for joining us today and for this discussion.
Thank you.
If we could just kind of go around, and if people want to ask questions or find a way to get in touch with you or find out more about you, if you could share some information about how to do that, that would be great.
Yeah, I do have a website, HW Apothecary, which is where I take most of my emails if anybody wants to reach me. Yeah.
Ashley and I were talking about this earlier. I have no Facebook, no Twitter, I got nothing.
You can find them at UConn Anthropology.
Yeah. My email is kevin.mcbride@uconn.edu, and you can reach me there.
As always, it's osa.uconn.edu to learn more about our ongoing projects, and you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram.
And we're FOSA, you know where we are.